Keanu Reeves sat quietly at the long glass conference table, his hands folded, his phone face down beside a plain paper coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The room was spotless modern. Expensive floor-to-ceiling windows, polished steel, framed awards lining the wall. His name was on more than one of them, yet the chair across from him remained empty. Minutes passed. Outside the room, footsteps came and went. Assistants crossed the hallway with tablets tucked under their arms, laughing softly, whispering updates to one another. No one stepped in. No one acknowledged the man waiting. A digital clock on the wall ticked forward, 10 minutes, then 20. Through the glass, Keanu could see into the adjacent boardroom. The executive team was already seated. Jackets off, tays loosened. Champagne flutes clinked as someone raised a toast. A deal had closed. Smiles were wide, laughter was loud. Papers were signed without hesitation. An assistant paused near the door, glanced at Keanu, then leaned toward a senior executive and whispered something. The executive didn't even look up. He waved a hand dismissively and murmured, "He's just the face of the company. He can wait." Keanu's expression didn't change. He didn't sigh. He didn't check his phone. He simply glanced at his watch, as calm as ever, and waited. Inside the boardroom, the celebration continued. Someone joked about how rarely Keanu showed up anymore. Someone else laughed and said the company had outgrown him. Another voice added, "Great guy, but this is real business." The words carried easily through the glass. Keanu heard everything. Still, he said nothing. 30 minutes in, the hallway grew quieter. The assistant desk settled. Phones stopped ringing. And yet, the man whose name was on the building was still being ignored in his own office. A subtle shift happened then, not in the room, but in the air. Keanu straightened slightly in his chair. His eyes lifted from the table to the boardroom beyond the glass. The faint reflection of the executives overlapped his own. They thought he was irrelevant. They thought he was patient because he was powerless. They forgot one simple thing. Keanu Reeves hadn't come to wait. He had come to watch. And what happens next will cost them far more than a delayed meeting. Because in just a few minutes, the people laughing behind that glass will realize they weren't celebrating a victory at all. They were sitting inside the moment everything falls apart. It was supposed to be a routine Monday morning at the company's headquarters. The kind of morning the executive team loved. Busy enough to feel important, controlled enough to feel powerful. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the lobby as employees hurried past security, badges swinging, coffee cups in hand. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but performative. Voices were sharp. Smiles were strategic. The executives had already taken over the building for the day. Meetings overlap. Assistants rushed from floor to floor. Decisions were being made quickly, confidently, without hesitation, and, more importantly, without one particular person in the room. Keanu Reeves. Years earlier, he had quietly co-founded the company, investing not just money but trust. He believed in building something ethical, something human. Over time, though, as the company grew and profits exploded, that belief became inconvenient. Board seats filled with louder personalities. Strategy meetings shifted tone. Numbers replaced values. And slowly, almost invisibly, Keanu was pushed aside. He wasn't rude about it. He didn't fight for attention. He didn't demand respect. That calm nature, once admired, was now mistaken for absence. Executives began to refer to him less as a decision maker and more as a symbol. A name. A brand. "He's great for press," one of them had said weeks earlier. "But we can't wait on him forever." This morning, they hadn't waited at all. Inside the boardroom, the executive team strutted through the agenda like conquerors. Suits were immaculate. Watches flashed when hands moved. Confidence filled every sentence. They spoke about acquisitions, restructures, and future direction with the certainty of people who believed no one could challenge them. Outside, in the adjacent conference room, Keanu sat alone. An intern passed by, slowed, and looked twice through the glass. Recognition flickered across his face. He hesitated, clearly unsure, before leaning toward a senior assistant and whispering, "Isn't that?" The assistant cut him off immediately. "Keep moving." The intern obeyed, but not without one last glance back. Keanu noticed. He gave the smallest nod, nothing more. Minutes later, laughter burst from the boardroom again. Someone joked about how quiet things had been lately. Another voice said, "That's what happens when the old guard steps back." Keanu heard every word. Still, he stayed seated. Calm, unbothered on the surface. Because while they believed the company had outgrown him, Keanu knew something they didn't yet understand. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, silently, until everyone else is comfortable enough to make a mistake. Inside the boardroom, the meeting rolled forward without hesitation. A senior executive stood near the screen, clicking through slides filled with charts and projections. Every upward arrow was met with approval. Heads nodded. Pens tapped confidently against the table. "This puts us in a whole new league," one of them said proudly. "We don't need to slow things down anymore." Another executive leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Especially not for someone who barely shows up." Laughter followed, easy, careless laughter. Through the glass wall, Keanu could see them clearly. He didn't need to strain to hear. Their voices carried, sharp and unfiltered. Each comment landed one after another, testing a patience they assumed was endless. A document was passed around the table, pages flipped quickly. No one questioned the details. No one paused to consider who wasn't there. A pen scratched across the final page, sealing decisions that hadn't been properly approved. "This is how real leadership works," someone said. "Fast, decisive." Another voice added, "We can't keep waiting for permission from ghosts." That was when Keanu moved just slightly. He reached for his phone, not in anger, not in haste. Calmly, deliberately, he stepped a few feet away from the table, keeping his voice low as he placed a call. The conversation was brief.
"Precise, there was no small talk, yes,"
he said quietly. "No, they haven't noticed yet. Bring everything." He ended the call and returned to his seat. Inside the boardroom, the celebration continued. Someone joked about how simple things had become now that complications were gone. Another executive raised his glass again, already savoring the future they believed they had secured. None of them realized what they had just done. The deal they were praising so loudly, rushed, unsigned by the proper authority, approved without full oversight, wasn't just bold. It was reckless, and the mistake wasn't hidden deep in fine print. It was obvious to anyone who knew where to look. Keanu knew exactly where to look. An assistant finally opened the conference room door and glanced in. "Mr. Reeves," she said quickly, avoiding eye contact. "They'll be with you shortly." Keanu nodded once. No rush. The door closed again. Inside the boardroom, the screen went dark as the presentation ended. Chairs shifted. Jackets were straightened. Someone said, "Let's wrap this up and bring him in. We'll fill him in." They believed they were still in control. Keanu stood up. He adjusted his jacket, picked up his coffee cup, then paused and set it back down untouched. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture had. The patience was still there, but now it had an edge. He looked through the glass one last time at the executives congratulating themselves. "All right," he said softly to no one in particular. "That's enough." At that exact moment, footsteps approached from the hallway, measured, purposeful. The sound grew closer, steady and unmistakable. The room was about to change. And the people inside the boardroom were seconds away from realizing that confidence built on disrespect collapses faster than anything else. The boardroom doors finally opened. Two executives stepped out first, still mid-conversation, their laughter fading only when they noticed Keanu standing just outside the glass wall. The smiles didn't disappear, but they shifted. Controlled, performative. "Oh, Keanu," one of them said, checking his watch as if the delay were trivial. "Sorry about that. Big morning." Keanu met his eyes calmly. "I noticed." They ushered him in at last. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as space was made at the table, though no one fully stood. Screens were turned back on. Folders were slid aside, not closed, just hidden enough to suggest transparency without offering it. "Let's catch you up," another executive said, already reaching for a remote. "We finalized a few things. Nothing you need to worry about." Keanu sat. He placed his hands on the table and looked around the room, at the faces, the confidence, the comfort. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush them. The presentation resumed, this time faster. Numbers flew by. Terms were summarized, not explained. Every sentence ended with an assumption: "You'll agree, you'll understand, this is already done." Keanu listened. When the screen finally went dark, he spoke quietly. "I have one question." The room stilled just enough to notice. A senior executive smiled thinly. "Of course." Keanu glanced down at a printed summary that had been placed in front of him. "Which committee approved the final structure?" There was a pause. A brief one. Too brief. "The strategy team," someone answered. "And the ownership sign-off?" Keanu asked. Another pause, longer this time. "Well," the same executive said, leaning back, "we didn't want to slow things down with formalities." Keanu nodded slowly. "Interesting." The confidence in the room wavered, just a little. Someone cleared their throat. Another adjusted his tie. Before anyone could speak again, the door opened. The company's CFO walked in, carrying a thick folder under his arm. His expression was neutral, but his eyes went straight to Keanu. He stopped, nodded respectfully, then turned to the rest of the table. "You asked me to bring the documents," he said evenly.
"Yes,"
one executive replied quickly. "Just set them down." The CFO didn't move. "I think we should go through them." The room fell quiet. Folders were opened. Pages slid across the table. The mood shifted, not abruptly but unmistakably. Lines of text were read more carefully now. Numbers were revisited. Clauses that had been skipped were suddenly unavoidable. One executive laughed nervously. "We're overthinking this." The CFO looked up. "We're not thinking enough." Keanu remained silent, watching. The room that had felt loud and untouchable minutes earlier now felt smaller. The air was heavier. Each page turned sounded louder than the last. "This section," the CFO continued, tapping the document, "requires direct authorization." Eyes flicked toward Keanu, then away. Someone tried to redirect. "We can sort that out later." Keanu finally looked up. Later already happened. No one responded. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was draining fast, replaced by something colder, uncertainty. The executives who had rushed so proudly now avoided eye contact. Chairs shifted again, this time uncomfortably. Keanu leaned back slightly, his voice still calm. "I waited because I wanted to see how decisions were made when I wasn't in the room." No one interrupted him. "And now," he added, "I've seen enough." Outside the glass walls, movement picked up. Security staff stood a little closer than before. Assistants watched through the windows, sensing that something irreversible was unfolding. The meeting wasn't just off track anymore. It was unraveling. And everyone in the room understood, at last, that this wasn't a discussion they were leading. It was a reckoning they had walked into themselves. The room stayed silent longer than anyone expected. Pages lay open on the table, untouched now. The energy that had fueled confident decisions earlier was gone, replaced by careful breathing and guarded glances. The executives looked at one another, silently searching for reassurance that no one seemed able to give. The CFO straightened the folder in front of him. "There's more," he said evenly. One executive tried to smile. "Of course there is. That's why we have teams." The CFO didn't return the smile. He turned another page. "This agreement shifts controlling authority. That requires majority owner approval." A pause followed, sharp and unmistakable. Someone finally spoke. "We assumed that was already understood." Keanu lifted his eyes. "Assumptions are expensive." The words were calm, almost gentle, but they landed harder than anything raised in anger. The room seemed to shrink around the table. Jackets were pulled tighter. Hands folded where they hadn't been before. The CFO continued. "As of this morning, these approvals were never granted. Which means the deal you finalized," he tapped the page once, "is invalid." A chair scraped back slightly. Another executive leaned forward, his voice quick. "That's a technicality. We can correct that." Keanu shook his head slowly. "No, you can't." They all looked at him now. "For weeks," Keanu said, "I was told meetings were postponed. Decisions delayed. I was reassured that nothing significant would move without me." He paused, letting the words settle. "Today, I waited outside this room and listened." No one interrupted. "I heard jokes," he continued. "I heard certainty. I heard people deciding what mattered and who didn't." An executive spoke defensively. "This isn't personal." Keanu met his gaze. "That's exactly why it's a problem." The CFO slid another document forward. "There's also the matter of voting rights. Mr. Reeves still holds controlling shares." The color drained from a few faces. One executive laughed, sharp and uneasy. "He wouldn't." Keanu's voice cut in, quiet but firm. "I would." The laughter stopped instantly. Another executive tried a different approach. "Keanu, you're known for being reasonable. We were moving fast for the company." "Fast," Keanu replied. "Who'sn't the same as right?" Silence again. The weight of the moment finally became unavoidable. The executives who had dismissed him earlier now sat rigid, their confidence replaced with calculation. Someone glanced toward the door. Someone else cleared their throat and said nothing. Keanu stood. No dramatics. No raised voice, just a simple motion that drew every eye in the room. "I didn't come here angry," he said. "I came to understand who you are when you think no one is watching." He looked around the table once more. "Now I know." One executive tried to deflect. "So what, this is a lesson?" Keanu nodded slightly. "Yes." He turned to the CFO. "Proceed." The CFO closed the folder with a soft, final sound. "Effective immediately," he said. "This board session is terminated. An emergency ownership review is now in effect." Chairs shifted sharply. Voices overlapped for the first time, protests, explanations, apologies rushing out all at once. Keanu raised one hand. The room fell quiet. "Canned," he said calmly, "doesn't mean weak." That was the moment everything changed. What the executives had mistaken for patience revealed itself as restraint. What they had mistaken for silence revealed itself as authority. And in that quiet room, surrounded by documents and consequences, they finally understood the truth. They hadn't been running the company. They had been borrowing time, and it had just run out. The protests faded as quickly as they had begun. No one wanted to be the next voice to break the silence. The executives sat frozen in their seats, caught between disbelief and dread, their earlier confidence now replaced with careful stillness. The room no longer felt like a place of power. It felt like a courtroom without a judge's bench, everyone waiting for a verdict they already sensed was coming. Keanu remained standing, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't satisfied either. It was focused, measured in the way only someone certain of their ground could be. "This isn't about punishment," he said calmly. "It's about responsibility." One executive swallowed hard. "We can fix this," he said quickly. "We'll reverse the decision. We'll issue apologies. We'll do whatever you want." Keanu shook his head. That would miss the point. He turned to the CFO. "Please read the findings." The CFO opened a second folder, thicker than the first. "Over the past 6 months," he began, "multiple decisions were made without proper authorization. Ethics reviews were bypassed. Internal concerns were dismissed." A low murmur moved around the table. Keanu looked toward the far end of the room, where the intern stood quietly near the door, trying to make himself invisible. "You," Keanu said gently. "You noticed me this morning." The intern froze, then nodded nervously. "Yes, sir." "You tried to speak up," Keanu continued. "Yes." Keanu turned back to the table. "That matters." The words landed harder than any accusation. Several executives looked down. Keanu took a breath. Leadership isn't about who speaks the loudest or moves the fastest. It's about who protects the people who don't have power yet. He gestured slightly toward the CFO. "Effective immediately, the CEO position is terminated." A sharp intake of breath filled the room. The CEO, Keanu continued, also terminated. Another pause. Another chair shifted. 2 senior executives involved in unauthorized approvals. He added evenly, or relieved of their duties. No yelling followed. No arguments were made. The decisions were too clean. Too final. Security stepped forward, not aggressively, just present. A reminder that the moment had passed beyond negotiation. Keanu turned back to the intern. "You're moving to strategy review," he said, "with mentorship." The intern's eyes widened.
Thank you.
He said quietly. Keanu then looked to a senior staff member seated near the window, an employee who had remained silent throughout, never laughing, never dismissing. "And you," he said, "will serve as interim operations lead." The staff member straightened, stunned. "I'll do my best." "I know," Keanu replied. The executives who remained seated now understood something irreversible had happened. This wasn't chaos. This was structure being restored. Keanu finally sat back down, folding his hands as he had when the day began. "This company doesn't need fear to function," he said. "It needs trust." No one contradicted him. "I waited today on purpose," Keanu continued. "Not to test patience, but to observe character." He stood once more, this time signaling the end rather than the beginning. "Meetings will resume next week, with new leadership, with transparency." The CFO closed the folders. Assistants opened the doors. One by one, the former executives were escorted out, not in disgrace, but in silence. Keanu remained behind for a moment. The same chair, the same room, but everything else had changed. He picked up his untouched coffee cup, smiled faintly, and set it aside again. Some lessons didn't need to be rushed. They just needed to be seen. The room emptied slowly after that. Footsteps faded down the hallway. Doors closed softly. The hum of the building returned to normal, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But the air inside the conference room felt different now, lighter, clearer, stripped of the tension that had quietly built over months. Keanu stood alone for a moment, looking out through the glass walls at the city below. Traffic moved as it always had. People hurried along sidewalks, unaware that a quiet reset had just taken place several floors above them. Power, he knew, rarely announced itself with noise. Its most lasting moments often passed without applause. He thought back to the beginning of the day, the waiting, the dismissal, the assumption that silence meant weakness. It wasn't the delay that mattered. It was what the delay revealed. Respect, after all, is easiest when it costs nothing. Anyone can be polite to someone they believe is important. Anyone can listen when the speaker holds obvious authority. The real test comes in moments of uncertainty, when you don't know who someone is, what they control, or whether treating them well will benefit you at all. That was the test the executives had failed. They hadn't lost their positions because of one rushed decision or a single careless joke. They lost them because, when they believed no one was watching, they showed exactly how they valued people. They mistook speed for leadership, volume for confidence, and hierarchy for ownership. Keanu turned back toward the table, running a hand lightly along its surface. This company had been built on an idea much simpler than profit or prestige. It had been built on trust, the belief that power should protect, not diminish, that success should elevate more than just those at the top. Somewhere along the way, that idea had been treated as optional. The intern passed by the doorway again, this time pausing openly. He looked nervous but hopeful. Keanu smiled at him. You did the right thing today, he said. The intern nodded. I wasn't sure it would matter. It always matters, Keanu replied. You just don't always get to see when. As the intern walked away, Keanu reflected on how many people never get that confirmation, how many moments of quiet integrity go unnoticed. And yet, those moments shape cultures far more than speeches ever could. True leadership isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need to remind others who's in charge. True leadership listens. It watches. And when it acts, it does so with clarity rather than cruelty. What happened in that boardroom wasn't revenge. It wasn't ego. It was alignment, bringing actions back in line with values that should never have been sidelined in the first place. The firings weren't the point. The lesson was. Because one day, everyone ends up on the other side of the glass. One day, you're not the loudest voice in the room. One day, your title doesn't protect you. One day, the person you overlooked is the one deciding what happens next. And in that moment, only one thing truly matters: how you treated people when you thought it didn't. Keanu gathered his things and headed toward the door. No cameras followed him. No announcement echoed through the halls. The company would move forward quietly, reshaped by choices made without shouting or spectacle. That was enough. Outside, the city continued its rhythm. Inside, a new one had begun. And for everyone watching this story unfold, the message is simple. Be careful how you treat people when you think you're untouchable. Be mindful of who you dismiss when you feel secure. Because power changes hands more often than people realize, and character is always remembered longer than authority. More stories like this are coming. Stories about quiet strength, unseen choices, and moments that change everything without raising a voice. Let us know which part of this story stayed with you the most. Your feedback helps shape what comes next, and it helps ensure that the stories we tell continue to honor the values that matter most. Until then, remember, true power is calm, true respect is constant.